Hey everyone, I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado. Welcome back to All Up in Your Business, where today we're going to do another special edition of my Contracts series. And in fact, this is a special edition of my special edition. Is a special edition of All Up in Your Business, and this is kind of a special edition of It's kind of like Inception. I'm like Leo or Joseph Gordon-Levitt. It's like All Up in Your Business, Inception style. Anyway, in this very special edition of All Up in Your Business, we're going to talk about the contract issues in the new Netflix documentary, Pepsi, Where's My Jet? If you're new to All Up in Your Business, you may have missed some of my previous episodes of where I talk about contracts, and it's called because that's what I find myself saying often when I'm reviewing and reading contracts, because they're difficult to read sometimes because people don't always write them very well. So anyway, I've done a few special videos where I've talked about different stuff having to do with contracts, and this is a special episode of that special type of video where we're going to talk about the contract issues in this Netflix documentary. And if you are new here, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already done so. Click the little bell so you get notified anytime I post a new video, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. So if you aren't already aware, Netflix recently released a documentary called Pepsi, Where's My Jet? And like the lazy lawyer I am, I spent the whole day yesterday binging it. I mean, not the whole day. It's only like 3 episodes and they're not very long, but I watched the whole thing yesterday. And I guess before I get into the whole thing, spoiler alert, it's a real story. It's a documentary. So but if you haven't seen it, you don't want to have any idea what happens. Spoiler alert, maybe don't watch this video, go watch one of my other ones. So Pepsi, Where's My Jet? What's the story behind this documentary? What's going on here? Back in the 90s, Pepsi did this promotion for Pepsi stuff, where if you get Pepsi, you collect points, and with certain amounts of points, you can buy stuff like a Pepsi sweatshirt, a Pepsi hat. And they run this commercial promoting Pepsi points, this whole promo thing. They run a commercial, and in the commercial at the end, you see a young man hopping out of a jet. I think it's called a Harrier jet. Is that right? Harrier jet? PepsiCo. Yeah, okay, a Harrier jet.
The more Pepsi you drink, the more great stuff you're going to get.
Sure beats the bus.
You see a young man jump out of a Harrier jet, and at the bottom it says 7 million points. And at the time, a young man, I believe he was a teenager at the time, he sees this commercial and he thinks, holy crap, I want to get myself one of those jets. And he and his friends come up with this big business plan and idea of how they are going to get enough of the points that they need to get this jet through this Pepsi promo. And then they have this business plan for what they're actually going to do with the jet afterwards, and it's this whole big thing. And eventually they do actually, they realize some little bit of loophole where you don't need the points, you can buy the points. They send a big fat check to Pepsi and they're like, hello, we'll take one jet please. Pepsi's like, hey, it was a joke. And then legal issues ensue. The kids who are now adults in the video, they're like, no, we want this jet. You told us we could get this jet for 7 million points. Pepsi's like, chill out, dudes. It was a joke. You're clearly just some money grab. How much can we pay you to make you go away? And then it turns into a big case. And what I really love about this documentary, honestly, I hope Netflix and other streaming channels, I hope they start doing more of this. I would love to see more documentaries and even like scripted shows explaining historical legal cases and legal precedent, because in my research since then, and they mentioned this in the documentary too, this case is now something that they teach in law schools. I may have actually learned about this case when I was in law school. I don't remember exactly, but I remember talking about a similar story and certainly learning about advertisements and stuff in contracts class. But I love this. I hope they do more of it, because this documentary really reads like a big law school outline. If you've ever taken a law school class, I'm sorry, but you might be familiar with like IRAC, IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, our legal outlines, and that's how we break down cases. And the documentary really kind of does it in that similar style. And it would be so interesting and cool to get to see all my favorite legal cases played up across the screen. Can you imagine coming to Netflix next season, Res Ipsa Loquitur, a tale about 2 young lovers whose whose romance is tragically cut short from a falling barrel of flour. What a story that would be. I love that. Okay, anyway, let's get back to this. So early on in the documentary, in the first episode, I noticed something pretty quickly that got me really excited. And if you pay attention, you might notice this too. But early on, we hear people using the word offer a lot. No fine print, it's a legitimate offer. We hear the people involved, the lawyers involved, talking about, was it an offer? Offer. And if you don't know, you might be thinking to yourself, why is everyone so concerned about, is this an offer? Because if you've watched my first episode in my series, you'll know that a few things are required to make a contract. Two of those things are an offer and acceptance. If you have an offer and you have acceptance and a few other things, you have a binding legal contract. Without an offer, there is no contract. So the first issue here is this advertisement an offer? Is this commercial an offer? And if so, did these kids accept that offer? And by doing so, did they form a binding contract? A big deal, something that's mentioned over and over again in this commercial, there are no disclaimers, there's no fine print, there's nothing that says this is a joke, or, you know, jet not actually available for 7 million points. There's nothing that leads people to believe that this isn't serious, aside from, which is Pepsi's argument, the context, the joke, that it's obviously not serious, because who would think that you could get a jet for 7 million Pepsi points? But anyway, there's no disclaimer, there's no special language there. Pepsi's position is that it's a joke and no one would take this as a serious offer. Whereas the plaintiffs in this situation, that the kids, I'm going to refer to them as kids, but they're adults now. The kids, they're like, well, no, we did take it as a legitimate offer and we want our jet. Wrapped into, I mean, there are a lot of issues going on in this case and in this documentary. The main one, the kind that they really focus on, is the contract issue of was this advertisement an offer? There are also some other issues worked into it, like false advertisement, misleading advertisement claims, things like that. And there are other details that come into play that really let it kind of slide back and forth, which I think is a good thing with documentaries. If you're like, oh, I'm on this person's side in the first half, and then on the second half you're like, oh wait, no, I'm on this person's side now. I like that. But there are a lot of facts that come up that were like, oh, well, that kind of changes things. For example, it comes up later in the documentary that Pepsi had been running a similar advertisement in Canada as well. But on the Canadian commercial, they did put some kind of disclaimer language at the bottom of that Lear or the Jet giveaway portion. And there's also some talks that in developing this commercial and this advertisement, whoever the creative director who initially created it had originally put like 700 million points were required. But then people looking at it, at Pepsi, they were like, no, that's too many words, or that's too many numbers. Let's cut it down. It's too hard to read. 70 million. And then eventually they landed on 7 million. So part of the kids' point of view is that, well, they were trying to make us think that this was a real offer. Because if it was 700 million, that would obviously be absurd. 7 million's different. And if they put the disclaimer in the Canadian advertisement and not in the American one, it's because they wanted to mislead us or something like that. Ultimately, and here's the biggest spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how the case ends and kind of wrap up the final episode of this documentary. So if you don't want to know, stop watching now. But ultimately what happens, Pepsi moves for a summary judgment, which means they ask the judge to, this doesn't go to like a full-on trial. They're asking the judge to make a ruling because Pepsi wants to avoid going to a jury trial. Why does Pepsi want to avoid going to a jury trial? What they say in the documentary, what not Pepsi, the other party says, is because, and this is somewhat somewhat true. Large companies, large corporations tend to not want to have jury trials when they're up against individuals, people, because juries will usually be more sympathetic towards the individual than they are to these large corporations. Individual jurors won't often take as much of a sympathetic approach when it's a big corporation that the person's up against versus a judge. They won't necessarily have that kind of, issue. They'll look at more of a fact-based, looking just at the law. So, Pepsi wants to avoid going to a jury trial, so they move for a summary judgment, and the judge finds in their favor. So basically, the judge finds that no, this wasn't an offer. This wasn't a legitimate offer. These kids aren't actually entitled to receive this jet or any kind of compensation related to this. The folks that they interview in the documentary, the kids who are now adults who were involved in this, their feeling, their position is that had this gone to a jury trial, it may have been found more in their favor because they would have had the opportunity to have average, normal, everyday people see the commercial and say, yeah, I would take this seriously. Yeah, I would think this was an actual offer, versus, not having that opportunity to say, here's what real people, reasonable people thought when they saw this commercial. And so they thought not having that opportunity was what kind of screwed their case, because the judge, has a more, sitting up in their ivory tower on the bench. They're not a normal everyday person like the rest of us. They have a different point of view, which that certainly there could be some, I'm not saying that's incorrect, but I did read through the actual opinion from this case, the court's opinion, and it's, obviously the judge writes a lot of stuff, does a full breakdown. Ultimately, what the court is saying is that, the general rule in contract law is that an advertisement is not an offer. A regular advertisement is not an offer. So if we advertise something and a person comes into our business to purchase it, we don't have to sell it to them on those exact terms in the advertisement because it wasn't an offer. We didn't form a binding contract. So essentially, in the end, the court decides that no, this advertisement, this commercial wasn't an offer, and the kids weren't entitled to get that jet or any kind of compensation in exchange for not being able to get the jet, and Pepsi wins. And then years later, this case makes it into the law books and the case books, and people start talking about it in law schools and start studying it, and we remember it forever. But for the rest of us, for the rest of you who may not be law students or don't want to be law students and are just mere business owners, what can the rest of us take away from this Netflix documentary and Pepsi Where's My Jet? What can we learn from Pepsi? Number one, contracts are everywhere. A contract isn't just a piece of paper that you write a bunch of things on and you sign and the other person signs. Contracts can be everywhere, even potentially on advertisements and promotions and things like that. The number two key takeaway, have a lawyer review your advertising and your marketing materials. Something that they don't really address too much in the documentary, like they kind of touch on it, but it was like, where was Pepsi's lawyers in all this? Where was the review? How did the legal department say, yeah, okay, let's put this commercial out there without a disclaimer? Did no one question this? I'm assuming there was some discussion about it, and ultimately they decided that it was a joke and no one would take it as a serious offer. But anyway, for the rest of us, make sure you have a lawyer review your advertising, your marketing, because you don't want to get into a sticky situation like Pepsi does, or get in other issues with potential FTC claims for false advertising or any other hot legal water. And finally, I think the biggest takeaway, and this documentary does a really good job at hammering this home, there is a theme throughout the documentary of this David versus Goliath thing. The little guys, these kids who are now adults, the little guys up against this behemoth company, PepsiCo, and up against their lawyers, their legal team, their millions and millions of dollars. The little guy versus the big guy. This is a continuing theme that they talk about a lot, and we see the folks who were initially involved, who are adults now, talking about how this is a theme throughout their lives of, taking on risks. And even if the system doesn't favor the little guy, even if the courts are, you know, maybe more biased towards the big corporations, whatever it is. You gotta keep going for it, keep getting out there, keep climbing the mountain, and not letting all this stuff hold you back. And really, I think that's the greatest lesson of them all. So anyway, if you haven't watched Pepsi Where's My Jet yet, I recommend it. It's fun and interesting, and you might learn some stuff about contract law. If you learned a thing or two in this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Click that little bell so you get notified anytime I post a new video, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. If you want to watch one of my previous videos, you can check this one out. It's a great one. I'll meet you over there. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.